This is part C of the lecture on loss. We continue by talking about what's called systemic loss. Anytime your family system or group systems change, there's a sense of loss. If a child leaves home, even to go to college, to go take a job for good reason, but it's still, there is a change in the system there, and that produces a sense of loss. Perhaps a fellow worker leaves from where you work. Family from your church or your preacher leaves. Anytime there's a change of people around you, it can create a sense of loss, and can, if that sense of loss overwhelms your coping mechanisms, that sense of loss can create a crisis. So the question to ask people who come to you, and if they seem to be in crisis, but there's no visible emergency, they're not ill, no one has died, a question to ask might be, has any significant person recently left your life or your group? Then there are threatened losses, losses that have not happened yet, but threaten to happen. The doctor says that you need a biopsy. Your spouse says, I'm thinking about a divorce. The rumor comes around at work that we're downscaling. Terrorism, a hurricane's on its way, flood warnings, tornado warnings. All of those are threatened losses that can throw one out of balance. They're also what we call ambiguous losses. Now, that's an interesting title because the word means sort of vague, uncertain, undefined, undescribed. And ambiguous by itself is ambiguous, but there are basically two kinds of ambiguous losses. Some of them are things like, an adoptee search for their parents, the World Trade Center strike, Alzheimer's disease and abortion, or childhood abandonment, physical and emotional abandonment, the loss of childhood from physical or sexual abuse, the family members in jail, a chronic illness. All of those are sort of ambiguous, but they create within the person a sense of loss, a sense that something has happened, that something has changed, and can create the natural result of a sense of loss, which is either anger or self-pity. So the question to ask then, if you suspect that there may be some ambiguous loss, is there any kind of loss that you've experienced that doesn't make sense or you can't seem to get closure over? Something that you cannot seem to get resolved in your own heart and mind. Ambiguous loss actually is the most devastating type because it's the most confusing. It doesn't make sense. You can't problem solve it. And of course, by definition, that's what creates the crisis. If I can solve it, it's just a problem and I get it taken care of. But if my coping mechanisms are overwhelmed and I can't deal with it, I'm in a state of crisis. And so what happens is, because you can't adjust to it, or the family can't adjust to it, or your co-workers can't adjust to it, the whole situation just sort of freezes in place, and everybody involved in it becomes just sort of unable to act, paralyzed, and unable to function. The family is denied the rituals that support a real loss. And it reminds you that life isn't fair. This is where people become very angry. Uncle George died in Vietnam, for example. And his body was never found. He was missing in action. How do you resolve that? There's no closure. There's no end to that. Then there's disenfranchised grief. Quote, according to Norman Wright, the grief that persons experience when you incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. Did you hear that? That's an important point. It cannot be openly acknowledged. It cannot be publicly mourned. It can't be socially supported. You can't go through the normal rituals that provide closure. For example, there are three types of disenfranchised grief. The relationship is not recognized. You have told someone that you love them, and they reject you. Or the loss is not recognized. People around you say, oh, it's no big deal. You can deal with that. Get over it. Or the griever is not recognized. See, one of the real dangers of spousal abuse, child abuse, any kind of physical or emotional or psychological or sexual abuse is that the griever can never tell people. Feels like they cannot talk about the loss that they've experienced, cannot talk about the crisis that they're in, and so it becomes disenfranchised grief that I can never, ever deal with because we don't talk about that. Then there are secondary losses. Losses that are not related to you directly, that are not something you have lost, but affect you. A friend, your provider. Simple little things like a handyman or someone who's your cook, a lover. The person who always wrote the bills and took at the house and took care of things for you. A sports partner, a mentor, a check bouncer, a prayer partner. Any number of things that are secondary losses that are not primary relationships in your life. You're not the one who was lost, but you've experienced a secondary loss. Teachers, motivators, counselors, business partners, in-laws, couples class, anything can be perceived as a loss. And depending on how you deal with it or don't, can result in a crisis. One method for helping people who have experienced loss or working with people who seem to have lost something, but they can't put their finger on it. They can't tell you exactly what it is they've lost. Perhaps it's an ambiguous loss, a secondary loss, a loss that involves this disenfranchised grief that they can't talk about, is to have them create a timeline of grief. Here's an example of a timeline of grief. You ask the client, the church member, the friend, to chart their experiences anytime they've had any kind of a loss in their lives. So here's an example of a timeline of grief for Eric Smith. Eric was born in 64. In 68, he lost his dog. Or pardon me, in 1968 he got a dog. But in 1970, Eric's family moved and the dog died. In 1973, a close friend moved away. In 1977, his parents divorced. In 1983, he lost partial vision in an eye, and his dream of playing Major League Baseball was over. In 1985, he discovered a tumor in his leg. It was diagnosed as benign a month later, but nonetheless, he still had to deal with the anticipated loss. In 1988, his wife miscarried their child. In 1993, he had a job transfer to the East Coast. In 1995, his closest dear friend died in a car accident. In 1998, his mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And in 2001, his uncle died in the Trade Center and was never found. And in 2004, his daughter left for college. Let's go back and look at Eric's grief experience. Notice that his losses actually began when he was very young. He lost a dog. If he was born in 64 and the dog died in 1970, he was 6 years old when his dog died. Probably the first loss in his life was the loss of that dog, who was obviously important to him, special. Then he moved away from friends, and the dog died. So here's a secondary loss. Here's a systemic loss because he moved away from his friends. And then in 1973, a friend moved away from him. Now, in 1977, then we have his first really major loss when his parents divorced. And then we have a physical loss in 83 that is compounded in several ways. First of all, he lost partial vision in an eye, so he's lost functioning. But more important than that, he lost the dream of ever playing Major League Baseball, which may have been the great dream of his life. Then we have another physical problem when a tumor is discovered in his leg. Again, it was benign, it wasn't cancerous, but nonetheless, there was an anticipated loss, there was the threat of loss, there was a physical attack to his physical makeup, all of which created and added to his grief. In 88, his wife miscarried a child. So now here's a loss of a relative, a child. He gets transferred to the East Coast. There's another systemic change. His closest friend dies in a car accident. There's a systemic change. His mother's diagnosed with Alzheimer's. That's just all kinds of difficulty wrapped up in that. Then in 2000, his uncle dies in the World Trade Center, is never found. There's ambiguous grief, unresolved grief, a real loss. There's a biggie. And then in 2004, another systemic change when his daughter leaves for college. Was he glad that his daughter was accomplishing something, that she was moving on with her life? Absolutely. But still he experienced loss. Now, what I would like for you to do in response to this lecture then is to create your own personal loss history, your timeline of grief. So your assignment coming out of this lecture, and it'll be in the Moodle classroom with some details, is for you to create your own personal timeline of grief from your first experience of loss to the present day. Remember, we said in the very first lecture that an important part of this is helping you understand your own responses to crises, helping you kind of look inside yourself. Because as you look inside yourself and see how you experience these things, you'll be able to understand better how other people experience them. So, we've talked about the kinds of losses that come in life. We've talked about the consequences of loss. We've talked about a loss history, which you then will write. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about the result of loss is grief. Because there are very few things in counseling that you can say always or never about. That this is always true or that's never true. But this is one that is always, always, always true. And that is that whenever there is a loss, there will be grief. Hear that again. Wherever there is any kind of loss, there will be a measure of grief. And in our next lecture, we're going to talk about what's involved in grief. Thank you.